Have you ever wondered why certain reactions catch you off guard? Why you lash out, withdraw, or feel crushed over things that seem so small on the surface? What if I told you that the part of you try hardest to hide, the anger, the jealousy, the shame, isn't your enemy, but your key to freedom? We live in a world that teaches us to curate light, but not to face our shadows. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And maybe that's the very reason we're stuck, because we keep trying to heal without ever daring to look at what's broken. But what if the darkness you fear is actually where your power begins? There's something about Carl Jung's idea of the shadow that hits differently once you've lived enough to realize how often we walk around with blind spots about ourselves. Jung once made a powerful distinction between what we bury in our personal unconscious, the things we pick up along the way in life, and what's deeper, more ancient, inherited from the start, the collective unconscious. That's where things like archetypes live, and the shadow is one of them. Now here's the thing. This idea that we all share some psychological blueprint, that there's a dark double of us, our shadow, tucked inside from the very beginning, isn't just poetic, it's painfully practical. Because while we spend our time focused on polishing our resumes, paying our bills, navigating office politics, or trying to keep peace at home, there's this other part of us operating in the background, full of old fears, shame, reactivity, and judgments. Not all of it came from our personal experiences. Some of it, it seems, is baked in. That's where the collective unconscious comes in. It's easy to shrug this off as abstract theory. But pause for a second and ask yourself, have you ever reacted to something or someone in a way that felt exaggerated? Like your anger wasn't just about that moment, or your guilt came from somewhere older than the mistake itself. It's in those moments we start to realize that not everything we carry is ours alone. When Jung talks about the shadow being the easiest archetype to access, he doesn't mean it's comfortable. It's the easiest only because life keeps showing it to us, in people we can't stand, in co-workers who push our buttons, in the parts of ourselves we try to silence because they don't fit who we think we are. We think it's just a bad day. But often, it's the unconscious rising to the surface. And the reason this matters so much today, especially for people like you and me, juggling adult responsibilities, navigating relationships, maybe raising kids, or managing teams, it's because if we don't get curious about our shadow, we end up projecting it. We blame our stress on that lazy colleague, our lack of direction on an unsupportive boss, our loneliness on superficial friendships. But really, we're just watching our unexamined pieces play out on other people's faces. I've seen this play out in small and big ways. A friend of mine, let's call him Mark, is great at what he does, a real professional. But every time a younger co-worker comes up with a fresh idea, he gets irrationally irritated. Not just resistant, genuinely upset. On the surface, it looks like arrogance, but deep down, it's fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant. That fear doesn't come from his resume or even his past. It's part of a much older human story. The part of us that fears being replaced, being forgotten. That's not just Mark's fear. That's a collective fear. His shadow knows it. The shadow, when unexamined, makes us feel like we're being real when we're actually reacting to ghosts. And that's why Jung's distinction is so important. The personal unconscious, that we can work with through therapy, journaling, even talking to a good friend. But the collective unconscious, that takes something deeper, an honest willingness to admit that not everything in us was shaped by our family, our schooling, or our culture. Some things are ancestral. They don't come with names or memories. They just are. And this isn't some mystical abstraction. It plays out in our everyday stress. Ever catch yourself reacting more strongly than a situation deserves, or judging someone for something that, if you were honest, you're afraid of in yourself? That's the shadow talking. That's a story older than you, whispering through your behavior. But here's the good news. Once you spot it, you don't have to be ruled by it. You can get curious. You can pause and ask, what part of me feels threatened here? That question alone opens the door from unconscious to conscious. That's how the shadow stops being your enemy and starts becoming your guide. In today's world, where everything is fast, performative, and often disconnected, this journey into the shadow might be one of the most grounded things we can do. It's not therapy speak or spiritual fluff. It's the grit of facing yourself. But here's the hard truth most of us try to dodge. Facing yourself isn't just hard. It's moral work. Deeply personal, uncomfortable, moral work. And that's what makes the shadow such a demanding presence in our lives. Not because it's flashy or dangerous in some theatrical sense, but because it holds up a mirror to our least flattering parts. Our envy, our bitterness, our pettiness, our pride, not in others, but in us. Carl Jung described the shadow as a moral problem, and he was right to do so. But let's be honest. How often do we treat our flaws as moral issues? In most cases, we just want to be better, not necessarily more truthful. We chase self-improvement, but often avoid self-confrontation. It's one thing to say, I want to grow, and another to say, I need to admit that I'm capable of being cruel, manipulative, selfish, or weak. The second one? That's the work. That's the shadow knocking. And the resistance to this, God, it's real. It's like trying to clean a room that doesn't want to be lit. You flip the switch, and the bulb flickers out. You open the window, and the wind slams it shut. It's exhausting. Because no part of us wants to admit that the villain we've always feared might not be out there. It might be tucked quietly inside, dressed in excuses and good intentions. I've noticed that this is especially true for people who try to do the right thing. People who work hard, show up, take care of others, keep their heads down. There's a hidden belief that being responsible somehow earns us immunity from inner darkness. But that's not how it works. Sometimes, the more we try to suppress what's unacceptable, the more it festers in the background, shaping our reactions in ways we don't even notice. Think about the workplace for a second. You have a coworker, let's call her Lisa, who prides herself on being supportive, kind, a team player. But whenever someone else shines, she gets irritated. Not openly, she's too composed for that. But it shows in little jabs, in passive comments, in withholding praise. She doesn't realize it, but part of her resents not being the center of attention. Her shadow isn't monstrous. It's quietly entitled, quietly competitive. And because she sees herself as nice, it never occurs to her to question that undercurrent. That's the moral trap of the shadow. It's not about whether you're good or bad. It's about whether you're willing to own the whole of who you are, even the parts that mess with your image of being good. The real battle isn't with others. It's with the parts of yourself you'd rather exile. And that's where morality comes in. Not in a judgmental or religious sense, but in the sense of personal integrity. Who are you when no one's watching? Who are you when you're hurt or jealous or afraid? Can you stay honest then? Not perfect honest. This kind of moral effort doesn't look heroic. It often looks like silence or apology or holding your tongue. It looks like stopping yourself mid-rant and asking, is this really about them or about me? It looks like discomfort, and that's why most people avoid it. But the price of avoidance is high. The more we repress, the more the shadow takes the wheel when we least expect it. You might find yourself lashing out at your partner for something small, or feeling inexplicably bitter after a co-worker's success, or making snap judgments about people who remind you of something unresolved in yourself. It all piles up, and in the end, no amount of meditation, journaling, or productivity hacks can substitute for the simple, gritty truth of facing your own darkness, of saying, yes, that part of me exists, and I will not let it control me by pretending it doesn't. When we do this, when we lean into that kind of truth, we don't just become more self-aware, we become more human, more forgiving, more grounded, more real. We stop expecting perfection from ourselves and others, and we begin to live from a place that's not curated or polished, but genuine. And in a world obsessed with appearances and performance, maybe that's the most radical thing we can do, to look at ourselves honestly, to sit with the discomfort and still choose growth, not by denying our darkness, but by walking through it with our eyes wide open. But the walk isn't quiet, is it? Because the shadow doesn't whisper, it grabs you by the gut. One of the more unnerving things Jung observed is that the shadow isn't just a moral blind spot. It's emotional, it's wild, and worse, it's autonomous. The moment you think you've got a handle on yourself, it can hijack your reactions without permission. Think about it. How often have you found yourself suddenly furious, defensive, deeply hurt, or resentful, only to look back and wonder, where did that even come from? Those are the moments when our shadow doesn't just peek through, it takes the wheel. And when it does, we're not reasoning adults anymore. We're reactive, primitive. That sounds dramatic, but it shows up in the most mundane situations. A team meeting where someone critiques your work, a sibling who makes a passive-aggressive comment, a partner who forgets something important. Suddenly, your reaction is bigger than the moment. You're not just reacting to them, you're defending something much deeper inside yourself. What makes the shadow so tricky is that the emotions it carries aren't just strong, they're sticky. They take over like a storm. And before you even realize it, you've said something sharp, made a rash decision, or shut down completely, and then you justify it. I was tired. They were being rude. It just wasn't the right time. But underneath all that, you weren't really in control. And here's where it gets real. The more we let the shadow rule without being aware of it, the more it shapes our life. Not just in explosive moments, but in subtle patterns. It's in how we avoid vulnerability, how we judge others harshly for the very things we hide in ourselves, how we sabotage relationships because intimacy makes us feel exposed. There's a primitive part in all of us that doesn't want to grow. It wants to protect, it wants to survive, stay safe, be right. That part lives in the shadow. And in the modern world, where we're constantly being measured, compared, and expected to perform, that primitive part gets triggered a lot. But here's the twist. We don't grow by repressing those emotions. We grow by listening to them, not obeying them. There's a huge difference. You can say, yes, I feel threatened, without acting like a threatened person. You can feel envy and still celebrate someone else's success. You can feel rage and still speak with dignity. That's what makes us human. Not the absence of emotion, but the presence of choice. I have a friend, let's call him Daniel, who told me once that he felt like two different people. At work, he was calm, competent, respected. But at home, he would snap at the smallest things. His wife leaving dishes in the sink, his kid asking too many questions. He hated that part of himself, and he tried everything to fix it. But nothing worked, because he wasn't listening. He was trying to outrun a part of himself instead of turning around and saying, "Okay, what are you really trying to tell me?" That's the shift. That's when the emotional chaos of the shadow becomes a compass. It still shows up. Of course it does. But now, it's not driving blindly. You're at the wheel. So yes, Jung was right. There's something deeply emotional and unruly about the shadow. And that unruliness doesn't make us bad. It makes us honest. If we can learn to sit with those surges, to recognize when our most primitive instincts are being stirred, then we gain something most people never do: freedom. The freedom to feel without being ruled by feeling. But here's where the shadow plays its most clever trick: projection. It's the part that says, "This isn't about me, it's about them." And it feels real. That's what makes it so effective. You don't feel like you're deflecting. You feel like you're just responding to the world being unfair, annoying, disloyal, shallow, whatever adjective happens to hit your sore spot that day. Jung pointed out that projection is one of the hardest parts of the shadow to recognize because it disguises itself as truth. You look at someone and think, "Ugh, they're so arrogant." But rarely do we stop and ask, "Wait, what is it about me that's reacting so strongly to them?" Sometimes it's because we carry that same arrogance, and we hate seeing it in others because we've never made peace with it in ourselves. Other times, it's the opposite. We've repressed that trait so deeply that even a small reminder threatens our sense of who we are. And that's the heart of projection. It guards the image we have of ourselves. If I believe I'm kind, I won't admit to being resentful. If I believe I'm independent, I won't admit to being needy. So when those emotions bubble up, the mind finds a scapegoat. Someone else has to carry the shadow so we don't have to. The problem? That someone else is often a co-worker, a spouse, a friend, or even a stranger in traffic. They become a screen onto which we throw parts of ourselves we're not ready to face. And the more intense the projection, the more convinced we are that we're right. It doesn't feel like a shadow, it feels like insight. But really, it's a loop. A loop that repeats until something in us decides to pause, reflect, and do the uncomfortable work of asking, "Is this mine?" I remember a guy from a project I worked on. Let's call him Brian. He was incredibly critical, always finding fault in others. To him, everyone was lazy, unmotivated, or not pulling their weight. At first, I took it personally. I got defensive. Then I started watching him more closely, and I saw it. He was terrified of being seen as weak, so he attacked any hint of it in others. He had no room in his self-image for vulnerability, so it had to be pushed out, punished when seen. What struck me was how unaware he was of it. He wasn't pretending. He really believed he was just being honest, holding high standards. That's what makes projection dangerous. It doesn't feel like evasion. It feels like clarity, until it doesn't. And I think for those of us living in the real world, juggling deadlines, bills, family dynamics, it's especially easy to fall into projection. We're busy. We don't have time to psychoanalyze every reaction, but maybe we don't need to go that far. Maybe it's enough to just pause when something hits a nerve and ask, "What's this really poking at in me?" Not with guilt or shame, but with curiosity. Because the moment you start asking that question, you chip away at the illusion. You stop outsourcing your discomfort. You stop editing the world so you don't have to edit yourself. And you start living from a place that isn't reactive, but reflective. That, to me, is the real work of integrating the shadow. Not slaying a dragon, but recognizing when the dragon you think you're fighting is really just a reflection in the glass. But what happens when we don't recognize the reflection? When we go on projecting our disowned parts onto the world, convinced the problem is always out there, slowly, almost imperceptibly, we begin to drift into a kind of psychological isolation. It's not always visible from the outside. You can still go to work, attend family dinners, even laugh with friends. But something inside starts to shut down. You stop trusting people, not because they failed you, but because they're carrying pieces of you that you've refused to accept. You distance yourself from warmth, from vulnerability, from complexity, because all of it feels like a threat to the clean, curated version of yourself that projection tries so hard to protect. It's a bit like building a house with mirrors for windows. Every time you look out, you see some version of yourself, distorted, misplaced, sometimes ugly. But because you don't realize it's your reflection, you try to escape it. You change jobs. You end friendships. You leave relationships. You keep hoping that the next place, the next person, the next situation will feel different. But it doesn't. Because you haven't changed the lens. You've only changed the scenery. And here's the quiet tragedy. The more projections we throw between ourselves and the world, the lonelier we become. We start to feel misunderstood, disconnected, even suspicious. We begin to assume that people are out to get us, or just incapable of getting us. And so we retreat. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, steady ways. We stop opening up. We stop asking for help. We stop showing who we really are. The cocoon forms, and at some point, it becomes safer than the risk of being real. I think many people live in this cocoon without realizing it. They call it being private, or independent, or just not needing much from others. But underneath that is often a wall of disowned projections and buried disappointments. A defense that started as self-protection, but slowly hardened into self-exile. And once you're there, the world begins to look colder. Not because it actually is, but because that's how the shadow works when left unintegrated. It colors everything. It rewrites the story in your head. People don't care. Nothing ever works out. I always get let down. But if you trace those thoughts back, you often find that they're not about what the world is. They're about what you couldn't face in yourself. This is why confronting the shadow isn't just about personal growth. It's about survival, emotional survival. Because without that confrontation, life becomes a loop. The same fights, the same patterns, the same disillusionments, over and over again. And each cycle reinforces the story that you're alone, that something's wrong out there, when in fact, what's wrong is that you've mistaken the map for the terrain. And yet, there's always a way out. It begins when we stop asking, why do people keep doing this to me? And start asking, why does this keep happening through me? That shift, subtle as it is, cracks the mirror. It doesn't solve everything, but it breaks the trance. You begin to see the outlines of your own shadow, not as a curse, but as a clue. Because the truth is, we weren't meant to live behind projections. We were meant to live in connection, with others and with ourselves. But real connection requires honesty. And honesty requires that we face our inner distortions, not just our outer disappointments. The world will never be perfect. People will still be flawed. But when you stop projecting your shadow onto them, something amazing happens. The world stops feeling like an enemy and starts becoming a mirror, a gentler one you can actually learn from. But not everything that stirs us comes from the shadow alone. Sometimes, the face staring back in that mirror isn't ours, not directly. It's something stranger, more symbolic, more charged. That's when we've crossed into deeper terrain, when what we're reacting to isn't just a reflection of our own behavior or flaws, but something archetypal. Jung noted this shift. While the shadow often takes the shape of someone of the same sex, a rival, a competitor, someone whose traits you dislike because they resemble your repressed self, there comes a point when the projection changes shape. A man may suddenly find himself obsessed, angered, or captivated by a woman, not because of who she is, but because of who she represents within him. That's when we're no longer dealing with the shadow, we're facing the anima. For women, the equivalent is the animus. These aren't just psychological labels, they represent the opposite-gendered aspects of our psyche. The inner feminine in a man, the inner masculine in a woman. And unlike the shadow, which we can sometimes pin down with enough honesty and courage, anima and animus often operate on a mythic level. They seduce us, idealize people, or turn them into enemies for reasons we can't explain. You'll know you're in that territory when your emotional response seems out of proportion, when a passing comment from someone you barely know feels like a betrayal, or when you place someone on a pedestal so high that their inevitable humanness feels like a collapse. This is the deeper challenge. Whereas the shadow might provoke discomfort or defensiveness, the anima or animus can possess us. It's not just that we see through them, it's that we feel caught by them. But here's the beauty in all of this. If we can recognize these projections not as signs of insanity or failure, but as invitations, we begin to realize that the psyche is always trying to show us something. The anima or animus often appears when we're being asked to integrate qualities we've denied: intuition, creativity, vulnerability, assertiveness, reason. Not traits tied to gender, but traits tied to wholeness. And that's the point, really. Wholeness. The shadow, the anima, the animus. They aren't flaws to be fixed. They're missing pieces of a puzzle we didn't know we were building. And while they often come to us first in the form of conflict, they eventually reveal themselves as doorways. But we only pass through if we're willing to stop fighting our reflection. That's the deeper task Jung left us with. Not just to become better people, but fuller ones. Not to conquer the unconscious, but to collaborate with it. To see in every frustration, infatuation, or irrational emotion, not a breakdown, but a message. And in this noisy, fast-moving world, where we're encouraged to hide our flaws, suppress our emotions, and outsource our self-worth, turning inward is an act of rebellion. Looking honestly at your shadow, confronting your projections, and recognizing the deeper figures that move within you. That's soul work. That's adult work. And frankly, that's brave work. So if you felt misunderstood, stuck, or like you keep repeating patterns that drain you, maybe it's not because you're broken. Maybe it's because your psyche is calling you inward, not to shame you, but to show you the map. And that map, it doesn't lead to perfection. It leads to integration, to peace. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of the shadow. Not that it disappears, but that when you face it, you finally stop running from yourself